Hello, and welcome to the Natural Phenomena, Stress, and the Developing Brain module of the ENIGMA-U course. My name is Aiki. I'm a student researcher, and I'll be guiding you through this topic today. And not just only this topic, we're also going to have another lecture together, which is about trauma. So stay tuned for that. And all right, let's dive in. So what you're looking at the right side is a visualization of the brain's dynamic structure, and which is very, very mesmerizing. So, yep, I think we would all agree that brain is not a static organ and it constantly reorganizes itself, constantly changes itself. And this property is known as neuroplasticity, which I'm sure you've heard of. And yeah, it simply refers to the brain's ability to change its structure, function, connectivity in response to the experience that a human being goes through or experiences. And so these changes can happen in multiple levels too, which from synapses to dendritic spines to larger scale networks, which we're mainly going to talk about today, because stress is the most powerful force in terms of what can shape the dendritic spine and growth and all of that, especially neuroplasticity too. It was bold of me to say most important, so I'm just going to say one of the most powerful and change that. But it really does have a huge impact. But it's also important to know that it can affect both positively and negatively. So depending on its intensity, duration, and when it happens during the development, we see differences. So yeah, in this lecture, we will go through all of the things, all the details I gave, and in addition, we will examine how stress influences the developing brain, how the brain and the body biologically respond to the stress, which brain regions are most involved, and why, and what they do, and what and how they are being impact, and how early experiences shape the long-term outcomes. So let's start with a definition of the stress. And in neuroscience, it's defined as a biological state that is triggered when the brain perceives a demand, a threat, or a significant change. And so this perception activates the coordinated responses across the central nervous system, endocrine system, and the autonomic nervous system. So as you can see here, it's also simply known as your body's physiological or emotional response to a perceived threat. But when we say threat, it's not very fair to just imagine it as something negative, because it's not inherently negative. In fact, it is evolutionary conserved system that helps organisms to adapt to challenges. And without stress, we would have difficulty in learning effectively, in responding quickly to dangers, which is like a survival instinct, by the way, or adjusting to new environments. And so basically, to survive, we need stress. Basically, to live and learn, we need stress. But if we do not want to be affected negatively by it, we need to be aware of how long and how intense, and whether our brain can return to the baseline afterward the stress or not. These are the symptoms that should be uh, observed as a human being, as a person. You should also observe these signals and patterns in yourself because these factors are especially critical during development, and development happens all the time. So, what are the signs of stress? How can we really observe the stress in a human? And so you can see some of the cognitive, emotional, behavioral, also, and physical indicators of stress. So, on the surface, we usually see things like changes in sleep, irritability, difficulty in concentrating, or physical tensions, which are the surface. But on the underneath, we usually see signs that are also measurable with biological changes, right? Like elevated heart rate or altered breathing patterns, which can be dangerous, or increased cortisol level, and even shifts in neural activity. So these are the general signs in a human being. But in children and adolescents, these signs might often look different. I'm not saying they're fully different. You can see all of these signs that you see on the screen, and the ones that I've just mentioned. Um, but just because our regulatory systems are still developing, we might see stress in another form or shape, which is maybe risk taking or withdrawal, the opposite, or having difficulties in academic life or emotional volatility. And so it's important to recognize these patterns, these signals, and know that they're not just simply behavioral issues, and sometimes in some situations, and they might reflect the interaction between the ongoing brain development and the stress physiology. So it's important to recognize this pattern and know that this is a fact. So, what are these types of stress, which I've just shared? Because I just said that they're not inherently negative, but okay, what is positive about stress, right? So developmental researchers typically distinguishes the stress into three types. First one is adaptive stress, which is also known as the positive stress. This is usually brief and very moderate. Its goal is to support learning and resilience and survival. So it can help you to compete in sport because it will help you to strengthen your resilience and help you to learn, focus, most importantly, perform. Um, there's also a tolerable stress, which is involves a bit more serious challenges. Could be like going through a family transition, but having a stable relationship and environment around you can allow you to return to the baseline. And this is actually the red line, whether you're going to cross to the chronic or stay tolerable and adaptive. But if you cross to the toxic stress, aka chronic stress, we see the problem happening. So chronic neglections or long-term instability can cause the toxic stress to happen. And this form of stress is mostly and strongly linked to changes in the brain development that we're going to talk about today. Okay, so developmental this, developmental that. What is exactly development of the brain? So you've covered this topic and you've learned about this, but I just want to tell you a new research that has been just published recently, and to give you an overview of why developmental stages are important, especially when we're talking about stress. So yeah, the figure you see on the screen comes from a recent work by from the University of Cambridge, and this fundamentally updated how we think about the brain development. And so this research shows five distinct developmental epochs, and they each have different trajectories that depends on the brain measure that is being studied. And I would highly recommend you to go and look at it. It would probably pop up if you just type Cambridge and the brain developmental research. And you can even pause this video and read it and then come back. I'm sure it will give you a new perspective in terms of looking at the developmental effects of stress. So yeah, and what you see on the screen is different brain systems that are matured or stabilized and plateaued at different times, because some might peak in childhood, some might peak in adolescence, and some might even peak in adulthood. And so this matters for stress a lot, because even though we're talking about development and how childhood and adolescence can have very sensitive brain periods, developing periods, it also proves that there's not just single vulnerable periods such as childhood or adolescence, but it's also safe to say that there are multiple sensitive windows where stress really can have the distinct effect on the structure and the function that we're talking about. And so whether you're a child, whether you're an adolescent, whether you're an adult, it doesn't change anything. You're still under danger if you go through a chronic or a toxic stress. So this diagram highlights the three core regions that are involved in the stress processing. We see amygdala, we see prefrontal cortex, and we see hippocampus. Obviously, these are not the only regions, but we see most affected, and obviously who affects as well, mostly in these three top core regions. So the amygdala, who detects the stress, in terms of structural changes, we see altered connections in volume And with functional changes, we see hyperactive stress response, which is incredibly dangerous because we see enlargement in the amygdala, and that really weakens the connection that it has with prefrontal cortex or with the amygdala. Um, so it's like a chain, and we break the chain. In prefrontal cortex, so it regulates the emotions and behaviors, we usually see, in terms of structural changes, having fewer and altered connections, and functional changes. There is difficulty in regulating thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And lastly, with the hippocampus, who provides the contextual memory, we see fewer connections, fewer neurons created, and smaller volume. And with functional changes, there is difficulty with memory contextualizing that I've mentioned, which is what it does mainly, and storing new learning, which is not what we want. And so it's very important to know these effects because that's mainly what it does to the brain. But w why and how it does, right? Because in a healthy system, usually these regions, not usually, these regions operate in a balance. And the prefrontal cortex modulates the amygdala activity, which also prevents the overreaction that might be a problem for the brain. Mhm. And during development, this balance is naturally skewed, though, because the amygdala matures earlier. uh, and and the prefrontal regulatory circuits develop more gradually. And so we see differences, especially in smaller age groups, because the connection and the balance in operation is not balanced yet. And so in addition to that balance, when we see stress altering the communication, it really disrupts um, the whole system. And so it's highly dangerous compared to more healthy and operating balanced healthy brain systems. But it also doesn't mean that it's not going to uh, uh, affect the adult brain either. So stress simply amplifies this imbalance, especially when exposure is chronic. That's when we see these effects. We don't see these effects in tolerable or adaptive stress. This is what we see in chronic and toxic stress and when there's an ongoing neglection. So this image also shows how stress hormones interact with the neural circuits. So uh, I think you can pause this video and kind of generally look at this table and see how is the interaction happens amongst the hormones and the neural circuits and how is it being perceived. But just to simply talk about it and give you an overview, so the cortisol binds to the receptors that are usually highly concentrated in the hippocampus and the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. And these regions, you see, are therefore particularly sensitive to the stress hormones because we see the the binding. And so short-term cortisol can release the adaptive stress effects, which we talked about, such as support learning and adaptation and survival instincts. But when there's a repeated exposure, that alters the synaptic signaling, signaling, dendritic structure, as well as network efficiency, especially in the developing brains. And under chronic stress, this loop that we see here, this is basically like a regulatory loop. The amygdala dominates the whole system, while the regulatory control, which is the main control center, is weakened, particularly in the developing brain, because as I've mentioned in the previous slide, it's still skewed in the developing brains. And so it is important in terms of the neural circuits, how stress might affect. And when amygdala gets dominated, we see dysregulations amongst the other brain regions. So again, I highly encourage you to pause and analyze this chart a little bit more. So what is a stress response of the brain? How is the stress response is generally being triggered, and when do we see the response? So this diagram illustrates the HPA axis, which is hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, but it's shortened as HPA axis. And this axis coordinates the stress response in the brain. So when there's a stressor that is being detected, the CRH that you see here is being released from the hypothalamus, which stimulates the anterior pituitary to release the ACTH hormone. And then it also acts as a on its target organ, which is the adrenal cortex. So this is again the loop that we see when there's a stress response. And so to simply, again, summarize what I've just explained, hypothalamus releases CRH, and then the pituitary releases ACTH hormone, and the adrenal glands releases cortisol. So that's how the cortisol is actually being released. And in a healthy system, cortisol feeds back to shut this response down. But in a developing brain, this feedback loop is still maturing and still not there yet to create this healthy balance. And so it makes the activation more prolonged, more likely. So this is a very important and a key mechanism that links the early stress exposure to a long-term neurobiological changes, because we see the effective changes in the brain when we see stress, especially in the developing brain, especially in these responses or core regions, because they're being developed. And when there's a stress, it is in the core, in the fundamental, being affected. So again, I highly encourage you to stop this video and also go over this scheme a little bit more to understand it. So there's also a mechanism of chronic stress, which is known as the allostatic load. So this figure introduces us the concept of this load, and this also refers to the cumulative cost of maintaining stability through repeated stress responses, right? Because there is something like that when we experience a repeated response in terms of stress. So chronic stress, imagine it like this: keeps the brain in a heightened state of activation. You can see on the screen in the chart. And over time, this can lead to reduced synaptic plasticity, or having more altered neurotransmitter systems, as well as structural remodeling of these sensitive regions. And so it's really important to highlight that during development, this high allostatic load can shift the brain's baseline functioning. So you can see here the chart. When there's a high allostatic load, we see new altered set point, and there's a stress stimuli. And so with the time and with the effectiveness, it goes higher. And there's a research done on this. I'm going to add all of the references in the end of the slide, and I highly encourage you to either click on them or Google them and read these to understand the mechanisms of chronic stress and the allostatic load and the HPA axis and all that I've shared a little bit more. Okay, so here we see the examples of structural changes that are associated with the chronic stress, right? I really love this image because it talks about the activation and deactivation of the brain. So neuroimaging studies, especially this study, constantly showed that there's a reduced hippocampal value in this one, and there's an increased amygdala reactivity during stress and thinning of the prefrontal cortex regions. So and then not just this specific neuroimaging study, that's why I said neuroimaging studies. There's multiple studies that are done on the chronic stress, and they usually show these results. And so these changes fundamentally help us to explain why the stress impairs with learning, why it impairs with also memory or emotional regulation with the prefrontal cortex or decision making, right? And you can look at the image here. So when you see an acute stress, you see the deactivation, which ultimately leads to dendritic loss and decreased volume in specific regions. But it's also important to know that during chronic stress here, we see activation in the amygdala, right? But that's not a good thing because when the amygdala is largened, that's when we see the problem. And so with mindfulness users, we see deactivation in the amygdala, right? And so these are very important, and prolonged presence of stressors can cause this, right? Now let's move on to the next slide and talk about the dendritic spine and the executive function that we've been mentioning since the beginning. And what is this? So this image shows how stress really alters the large-scale brain networks. And yes, it certainly does. The chronic stress that we're talking about disrupts this connectivity, especially within the executive control networks. And it genuinely makes it harder for it to sustain the attention, and regulate the impulses and also adapt to the new information that a human being is perceived. And so these effects are particularly impactful during adolescence when executive systems are still organizing. And this is what we're constantly going to say. It's really important because the system is maturing. It's really important because the systems are still organizing. And so this is kind of the pattern, but I still want you to know what really stress does. So let's go over the image quickly, but you can stop and look at it on your own too. But with prefrontal cortex, so we see reduction when there is stress, right? You can see with the dendrites, we see reduction. With the amygdala, we see enlargement, and that is the problem, right? The amygdala shouldn't be growing bigger because it takes over the control. It dominates the systems. With the hippocampus, we also see reduction from the control to the stress, and it's also a great explanation of what happens in the brain when there's stress. So feel free to stop and read them as well. So this figure zooms into the cellular level, and because dendritic spines are the primary size of the synaptic communication, which we've just seen, and when chronic stress reduces the spike density in the prefrontal cortex, that at the end of the day weakens the top-down regulation, which is the most important system in terms of our living. And we're going to cover that in a trauma lecture. I'm going to show you a full um, chart for it. But generally, it's enough for you to know that this provides the spine loss effects, and we're talking about it and what it causes, what does it weakens, a direct biological link between the stress exposure and the deficits in the working memory and the cognitive flexibility. Um, so, right, we talked about development. What about the prenatal stress in the fetal brain development? So the effects can begin even before the birth. And how does it happen? If mother's stress hormones like cortisol is high, well, it can cross the placenta and influence the fetus's developing brain. For instance, I hope I'm saying it correct. The synthetic glucocorticoids are sometimes given before premature birth to help the lung development. But the studies showed that the cortisol can cross the placenta. And it can affect neural proliferation or the migration or the HPA axis collaboration in the fetus. And so yes, these changes do not determine the outcomes and anything specific, particular, or very, very dangerous, but they do shift the sensitivity, which might also influence how the baby and how the baby's brain responds to the stress systems and to the stress later in life. My favorite part, adolescence. So adolescence is the second sensitive period because of its rapid synaptic pruning or hormonal changes, as well as the increasing social stress intersect with the still developing prefrontal cortex situation. So yeah, chronic stress during adolescence period, yeah, alters the corticolimbic circuits, that network of prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, and amygdala. And they all underlie the emotional regulation, reward processing, executive functions. And these changes increase the vulnerability to a variety of psychopathologies, which also includes the mood disorders and substance use and even anxiety, which is the problem. So yeah, chronic stress during this sensitive period does create high risk of maturation disruption by shifting the trajectories towards a long-term risk, and that's what creates a problem. Um, However, evidence-based strategies strengthen the regulatory circuits, and so it is possible to manage the stress and also reverse, which I'm going to cover in the next slide. But what does strengthen the regulatory circuits is basically physical activities, slow breathing, mindfulness, or sleep consistency, and healthy sleep schedule, and most importantly, supportive relationships, because social connection is the strongest biological buffer against the toxic stress. And so all of these little things you see here really helps to manage the stress. So, how can we reverse the effect? The developing brain, and not just the developing brain, but the brain develops all the time. So, I'm going to say the developing brain, but this consists every brain. It is highly plastic, which means there's a neuroplasticity in every single brain. And so, even after chronic stress, even after the neural circuits are being through the dendritic suction or the growth, they can recover through the spine formation and improved connectivity. From the same mechanisms that also allowed stress to reshape, can also allow it to heal. And the research shows that the supportive environments and the stress management strategies and stable relationships can restore the connectivity and the function. And so it's safe to say that the developing brain is not fragile, it is actually responsive, and we can reverse the effects. And by understanding how stress interacts with the developing brain, we can better support the resilience, learning, and long-term mental health. And if we are conscious about what is going on and what can happen, and what are the symptoms, what are the effects, how we can reverse, it will initially provide us the enough information to help others and ourselves. So here are the references. Feel free to visit them after this lecture or even during if you're interested, even in the next lecture. And I hope you enjoyed it. These will all give you enough information to have a great foundation knowledge in the stress in the developing brain. So thank you so much for tuning in and see you in the trauma lecture. Take care.